So, thank you for coming to this panel. Let's see, the formal title is Cultivating Business Leadership for Abundant and Equitable Housing. And we've got a pretty, small group audience today and panel. So, we'd love to make it a discussion. So if folks have thoughts or questions throughout, please feel free to jump in. And I'm sure there's a ton of experience in the audience as well as up here. So we'd love for this to be a discussion. I know one of our panelists couldn't make it just due to weather today, so we're a small group up here. I'll do some introductions and we'll get right into it. I'm the moderator for the panel today, Mike Westling. I'm an account director at Brink Communications. We're a communications firm based here in Portland. And we work with nonprofits, public agencies, coalitions across the country to advance progressive policy, behavior change, and social movements. Housing has been and really continues to be a massive focus for our team and our clients, and I'm really honored to have the opportunity to discuss that with all of you today. Next to me is William Henderson. William is the CEO of Ride Report. Ride Report's a technology company that helps cities efficiently harness shared mobility services to meet their climate and equity goals. William's a founding board member of Business for a Better Portland, which is an alternative chamber of commerce of over 400 businesses that want to make Portland work for everyone. He's organized businesses to help Portland make progressive policy strides like investing in affordable housing, creating middle housing, and eliminating parking minimums. And next to William is Ryan Hashigan. Ryan's a professional tricyclist. Is that how you like to say it? Tricyclist. And Ryan has founded and run several tricycle-based businesses in Canada and the U.S., including Icicle Tricycles, which builds commercial tricycles for customers all over the globe. And I'm going to let William and Ryan introduce themselves in a little more detail in a moment. But before we dig into that, I did want to call out the leadership of Business for a Better Portland, the presenting sponsor for this panel discussion today, especially the work of A.D. Leverett, who was previously the organization's civic engagement manager, and Ashley Henry, the organization's executive director. Over the last 5 years, A.D. and Ashley have raised housing and the layers of policy decisions that determine how affordable that housing is as a clear economic priority for the 400 plus members of Business for Better Portland. They've made connections between advocates, elected officials, public sector staff, and business leaders in ways that are rare in politics at any level. Their leadership, BBPDX, played a critical role in advancing changes to local and state residential zoning rules and helping pass ballot measures that establish regional funding for supportive housing services for those experiencing homelessness, as well as the construction and acquisition of new affordable housing. Each of our panelists today is a member of Business for Better Portland. They've all helped shape and carry forward that organization's housing advocacy work. So before we get to the questions, I wanted to pose a question to the audience and just get a little information about where folks are coming from. So how many of you work in the public sector for a government agency or an elected official? No one? All right, one is great. All right, we're gonna call on you in a little bit. No, don't let that scare you. How many work for nonprofits or advocacy groups or volunteer for advocacy groups? Great, that's what we want to hear. That too. That's right. That's what this conversation is going to be all about. Okay, great. So quite a few of you. And how many work in the private sector, maybe for a consulting business or just a business that's maybe unrelated? Maybe about a third of the folks today, and some overlap too between advocacy, which is great to see. So to start us off, William and Ryan, your day jobs aren't in the public sector, and they're not in the nonprofit sector. They're not in politics. Could you share with us in just a few minutes your housing advocacy origin story? So tell us a bit about who you are. Thank you. I forgot we're doing the recording. Tell us a bit about who you are, what your day job is, and what got you into housing advocacy. Let's start with William.
Yeah. So before I jump in, I just wanted to acknowledge something that is out of line with the intentions I know of this organization. Also, at Ride Report, we have a policy that we don't participate on manels. This is an all-white manel due to weather, and that stinks. Certainly doesn't reflect the kind of conversation we intend to have. But it's an opportunity. I hope that we can, like Mike suggested, sort of break down the walls between panelists and audience here and have more of a discussion. And that can at least bring a little bit more diversity to the conversation here. So that's the best I think we can do today. Yeah, absolutely. I would be uncomfortable not naming it. Great. So how did I get into housing advocacy? I mean, I think honestly it comes from that same sort of feeling of discomfort in not having an acknowledgement that private companies, and in particular technology companies, have contributed to some of the housing problems that we face in the region and in many other cities. And I think sometimes there's a whole list of issues that go into housing unaffordability. Just high-paid tech workers is, maybe not the biggest driver. But what I see consistently is that companies don't show up. They don't participate. So if they think that they're unfairly, scapegoated or part of a narrative of blame, they can kind of look to themselves for that because they're not participating in the conversation. And when I decided to start a company, I really wanted that company to be participating in some way in part of the solutions and understanding the problems. And that's ultimately what led to Business for a Better Portland. It was just conversations with other business owners and founders who had the same feeling of, I need to have a voice here. I need to be part of the conversation. And the business interests that are out there right now claiming to speak for business owners don't represent me. In fact, they couldn't be further from what I believe and the kind of role that I want to have or that I want my business to have in the community. And I think housing is at the middle of that, right? Because we all have to live here. We all choose to live here. And, no one wants to see a world where themselves or their coworkers can't afford to live in the city. It's also true that you don't want to live in a city where, your teachers or, folks that you depend on for essential services can't live in the city. And so that just, that's where it came from. It was that simple. It was just like, we want to live in a city where everyone that we work with and depend on can also afford to live in the city. And that led to creation of Business for a Better Portland and engagement in a lot of the issues that we face around housing.
Thank you, William. I really appreciate you calling out the panel as well. It's kind of frustrating to have a panel about using business voice to change the status quo while at the same time reinforcing it. I know there's many business owners and entrepreneurs in Portland that are making community change that are not here, and I think Business for a Better Portland and organizations like that are a great step in a direction of having more progressive voice. But I think we need to also continue to try harder to include more voices. My name's Ryan. I run a business, Icicle Tricycles. I started the business in high school, pedaling rickshaws and flower trikes and ice cream tricycles around. I also had a job as a laborer deconstructing houses by hand. And so I would fund the business in the wintertime by tearing down houses, and then in the summertime by pedaling rickshaws and ice cream and flowers. Our business has evolved into where we manufacture trikes for people all over the world, all over the US and Canada, ship as far away as Dubai and Iceland and Singapore. And we build trikes for small businesses, anywhere from folks doing like a farmer's market stand, a mom selling popsicles in Saskatoon, for example, to large corporations. We'll build trikes for Campbell's Soup to do sampling at the Super Bowl. We have 3 locations here in Portland and 1 in Victoria, BC. We have over 45,000 square feet of manufacturing space here. And I guess my transportation activism, or the business was really born out of transportation activism, trying to see how can we use commerce to promote engagement in our public spaces. How can we use, in this case, tricycles as a way to make our public right-of-ways more lively and engaging. I looked around the world and found out, that really us here in the U.S. was really far behind it. Almost, many other countries use tricycles as a very low level startup way to have commerce and engagement in the streetscape. And my transportation activism was also kind of born out of housing, in that I grew up in a very rural area. It was 13 miles to the nearest bus stop that I would have to bike on a pretty scary highway. And so, just having seen, my business was built both out of kind of activism and then, transportation activism and my housing experience. I also run a nonprofit, Better Block PDX, where we work with PSU students to take their planning and engineering skills to really let knowledge serve the city, and work with community groups to bring projects to life. So some of those projects that maybe people from here have seen is Better NATO or Better 3rd Avenue in Old Town, some of the bus lanes on MLK and Grand and on the Burnside Bridge. Those were all student projects that originated with community submissions, and then planning and engineering students made reports for the community.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks, William. So I wanted to get into some examples today, because I think specific examples of advocacy are a really helpful way to understand how to build those relationships across business connections, across business organizations, across advocacy communities, and across just different community organizations. So I was hoping that each of you could share a specific example of how you've used your platform as a business owner to advance housing policy or transportation policy, and what your role has been in relation to other housing advocates who might be coming to the civic discourse from probably more of an advocacy or nonprofit perspective. And what I really want to get into too is, did you coordinate with an organization or a coalition or both? Kind of what supports did you have, and maybe what supports did you help cultivate for yourself and others to feel confident in sharing your voice publicly and leveraging your position as a business leader? William, you had mentioned that oftentimes the issue is sometimes it's businesses actively speaking out in a way that doesn't align with your values, but sometimes it's just no one speaking out at all. And sometimes that's because they don't feel like they have the background or the knowledge of how to engage in that process. Would love for you to share an example, and then kind of, how did that come together for you? Why don't we start with William?
Let's see. I think the first thing to just point out is that the business voices that tend to weigh in are almost always just shooting things down. They're not proposing any solutions. They're not advancing anything other than the status quo, and they're doing it, by derailing anything that threatens the status quo. And so if you're a business owner that doesn't believe that the status quo is something that we should be shooting for, you have to really educate yourself and look out there in order to understand what your job is and what can be advanced. And the other thing that I learned quickly when I showed up, particularly as a business owner, is that it's rarely the role of a business owner to be proposing new solutions to these problems, right? There are folks out there, there are organizations out there who've been working for decades on this. They know the issues and they're proposing the solutions. And so you got to start by finding what's out there and figuring out how your voice can support that. And so I think a good example of that is around the affordable housing bond. I mean, affordable housing is just an issue that anyone that's paying attention, I hope, is concerned about. But it's also just a thing that can feel so intractable, and where do we begin? And so to build a relationship with organizations like Yes for Affordable Housing that are advocating for solutions and saying, there's actually a need for a business voice here, right? Because business voices so often criticize. You're seeing this right now with the implementation of the housing bond. Business voices coming out and saying, hey, this isn't being spent well, or this isn't meeting the goals, right? It's completely a false narrative. But it's easy for a business owner to, sort of claim that they have all of the answers when it comes to spending money wisely, and then threaten, nonprofits and advocates who are trying to spend that money in the community. So if you show up as a business owner and say, not spending this money is a poor choice to the community, and there's actually a lot of great work and good, efficient use of that money, that challenges the default narrative that, anytime we do affordable housing, it can't be done well. And I think that's just a good example of how to show up. The nice thing about that too is that when you show up in a way where you're educating yourself and forming relationships with existing groups, that creates a possibility in the future of new types of advocacy and new types of solutions. So I don't think you want to start there and jump into that, but I do think that anytime you bring in a new voice, new things are possible. And because there's such a dearth of business owners that are engaging in this way, especially in the Portland area, it can change a lot in terms of what's politically viable, what's politically possible. So yeah, I'll stop there. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, definitely. And I know, from our collaboration, as co-conspirators, with, using the Organization of Business Spreader Portland as some of that kind of that coordinating body. So to be able to share the load of what the opportunities are, I think that's one of the biggest hurdles, right, for business owners is, okay, I'd love to weigh in. I know generally I want more affordable housing. And I understand the issue a little bit from reading about it in the news, but when's the hearing?
Right.
And who's organizing the hearing and what other voices are there and how can my voice complement the other voices that are aligned in that effort, as opposed to maybe being a little off base or coming in sounding like I'm proposing a different solution than what's actually on the table.
Yeah.
But advancing, use that sports metaphor, the ball down the field, as opposed to just kind of going it alone and thinking, because I think that's oftentimes what we see when individual businesses weigh in sometimes is just, well, I run a business, so of course I know how to do this. And making sure that it's coordinated. And I know organizations like Business Spreader Portland have been essential in providing folks with the context for that advocacy work.
Yeah, and that builds the muscle, right? I can't tell you how many times I've seen a well-meaning business owner kind of swoop in with a solution, and then because they haven't done the work, it goes nowhere, right? It's not going to go the way that they're used to it going in their own business, where you can quickly make a decision and align everybody and move forward. It takes a lot more than that. And so then they get frustrated and say, oh, I don't have a voice, or I can't do anything, or it's just not going to make a difference. And so then that well-meaning business owner is now completely checked out from future advocacy. So getting people to the point where they see here are the issues, but here are the opportunities, right? Where can I step in and move the needle? I think that's so important, because at the end of the day, they got to run a business, right? They do not have the time and resources to do full-time advocacy like a lot of their colleagues in the nonprofit sector would be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know Ashley at Business Spreader Portland has described that as kind of the civic on-ramp, the way the springboard for folks to jump into that space if they haven't done it before. And Ryan, I know you've created some of those springboards in other areas as well. Sure. For folks in the community to get involved with advocacy. Could you share kind of a case study of how you've gotten involved in advocacy, either in housing and transportation, and what's that look like, and who did you bring, who came together, and what resources were available for them, and how did they coordinate across these identities of business owner, maybe citizen, advocate, neighbor, maybe folks in the public sector?
Yeah, I feel very privileged to be able to engage in the business associations in Old Town and Central East Side and some of the neighborhoods that our businesses operate. And it's oftentimes frustrating to see that business voice being used to really just hinder any possible solutions. And especially it seems kind of at odds with what a lot of us in business are doing on a day-to-day basis, which is trying to figure out solutions and trying to problem solve and try out different iterative approaches. And that business voice oftentimes just gets used to say no. And so on those occasions where people are proposing ideas and putting out solutions, it can be a real nice collaboration. One specific example is in Old Town. We had a Better Block project. At the time, it wasn't a Better Block project; it became one. But essentially, one of the bar owners in the neighborhood was proposing that we have crosswalks at all the intersections, and the city engineer said, "No, you can't do crosswalks. There's 3 lanes. It's a triple threat." And so the bar owner said, well, what if we just do 2 lanes, put in a bike lane, and have crosswalks at each intersection? And that was something that was able to provide consensus across the board. So the social service providers, the Union Gospel, Blanchet House, the bar owners, the condo owners, the traditional NIMBYs in the neighborhood were all in support of this common goal. And so it was really fascinating to see then how we were able to work with advocates with the Street Trust and the parking network and with PBOT itself to be able to kind of coordinate. And at first there was a real reticence to this solution and kind of like a distrust of, oh, well, is this actually going to be a solution that the bar owners are proposing in good faith? Ultimately, we tested it out as a 3-day project. We had PSU student planners come down and do the testing work on it, and it became this kind of great community building exercise that then led to future successes where we were able to work on, 2nd Avenue and NATO, and we built upon those relationships that had already been built because, Blanchet, the soup kitchen was seeing eye to eye with their neighbor that runs the nightclub. And those were relationships that really hadn't existed, and it was a way that everyone was kind of focused on getting to yes. So it's one example.
Thanks for that. And digging a little bit more, I'm wondering you both talked about relationships and how important that is to this successful advocacy and cultivating that relationship over time, and for folks to figure out where in the discourse and conversation they are in relation to each other and how they can complement their efforts. What advice do you have for housing advocates and folks in the public sector who are hoping to have business voices speak out in support of policy? Maybe they're organizing testimony, they're seeing a gap. They would love to have supportive business voices, or maybe they know there's going to be opposition from the private sector perspective. What can they do to encourage more people to do what you've been doing? Why don't we start with Ryan?
Yeah, I would say reach out and ask. And intentionally cultivate these voices, because we had a project here, and again, this is transportation related, but Central City in Motion, where the city was trying to make major investments in bus lanes and walkability and transit and biking. And the group that they were assembling was a private invite-only group of the Central East Side Industrial Council. It was the groups that have been the most traditionally opposed to and the kind of de facto voice for freight in the city. And to me, it seemed like if you want them to just say no to you, then invite the people that keep saying no to you. But there's a whole slew of businesses in the Central East Side that might not align with that vision, or that I know that don't align with that vision. So the intentionally reaching out, the open house was then kind of after a news story got leaked to the press about this being a private invite only. It became a more welcome or more open business invite, and the room was packed, and there was a very vibrant conversation with the bakery, Fran's Bakery, with the bike tours folks, and just being able to have those wider voices at the table allowed for a wider discussion that wasn't going to provide the predetermined outcome that the city was afraid of. So I would say just be intentional and seek out those voices that you would like to hear more from.
Yeah, so it might even take oftentimes it sounds like there's kind of curation or just defaulting to the status quo group of business owners that might weigh in, but it might take more than just opening it up and saying, this is open to all business voices, because you might get some of those same folks, but it might take some curation, reaching out, and relationship building up front.
And that's where Business for a Better Portland's great. I think for that particular meeting, we were working down some of the lists of Business for a Better Portland, who are folks that we can bring.
Mm-hmm. So not starting from scratch, but being able to, go to a roster of businesses that might not know about this issue, but want to be engaged, want to weigh in.
Yeah, and then working with the other advocacy groups. So working with the Parking Reform Network, working with the Street Trust, working with Oregon Walks, trying to find out who who else might have voices to share.
Mm-hmm. How about you, William? Any advice you have for our friends in the advocacy community and with public agencies?
Yeah, I mean, reach out to Business for Better Portland. That's your number one resource.
How about nationally? How about for folks that maybe don't have a Business for Better Portland, or maybe where it's just getting started?
Figure out how to get one founded. I mean, I don't know how true this is nationally. I'm guessing to some extent this is true everywhere, though. There's this asymmetry between the businesses that you want to be out there working with you and lending their voices. They're smaller, they're younger, and they're mostly fighting for their own survival, right? And then there are the businesses that you hear from all the time. They're bigger, they have money, they have people whose full-time job it is to just show up and tell you all the reasons that you can't do that, right? To lobby city halls. These are the folks that are used to walking the corridors of power, and they literally expect that their way is just going to, sort of be the way it's done. Otherwise, they get quite upset when they don't get their way. So if you want to not just hear from those folks, you have to figure out how to work with like these busy younger businesses who really don't know how to do advocacy or lobbying or any of that stuff. They don't even really know that that's an option. And that's why Business for a Better Portland exists, right? It was like literally like we need to pool our resources and essentially, have a resource for all of these businesses because we can't individually afford to do this and we don't know where to start. So if that resource doesn't exist in your city, then, I think step one should be figuring out how to create it. Maybe having a conversation with some like-minded business owners if they exist and talking about how you might start to pool resources. If it does exist, that's great. I would be looking to, who are the business owners who've shown up before for similar issues. When it comes to housing, locally there's been a lot of good work on middle housing is especially a relevant one to business owners. So I would be looking at that precedent. And then lastly, this is something that I think, Business for a Better Portland is done, but there's so much more opportunity here. Think about the employees at these businesses, because I gave you a list of things that these businesses are smaller and less resource, sort of things that are challenges, but there's also opportunities. And I think the biggest opportunity is that the businesses that you want to be showing up are more responsive to their employees, to the needs and the values of their employees. Their employees are increasingly expecting that their employer represents their values, and if they don't, they walk, and it's an economy where that's a big threat. Right? So if you have employees who are already on your lists or who are already volunteering with your organization, figure out how they can get their boss or their CEO to the table and say, hey, did you know that your employees are already participating in this organization? How could you how could you better facilitate that? Could you have a lunch and learn with this organization so that other employees can find out about this issue? And the business owner doesn't have to take any of their busy time to show up for City Hall. That doesn't have to be step one, right? It could be more at the employee level.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation, just that it doesn't need to be engaging business owners only. I think that's just a very difficult task, as I'm sure both of you can attest to, of just the time and attention and also possibly perspective on, is this my role? I'm trying to run a business. Yeah, I care about that, but it's just not something that I see as something that is my maybe responsibility or role at this time. So cultivating those relationships across all levels of the private sector, regardless of where folks are, and recognizing that the folks that are probably the most impacted are, at some employee level, right? And so those are the folks that might be the most energized and might be advocating on their own, but not realizing that they could also help cultivate that private sector perspective. And thinking about that private sector perspective, why do you think it is that business voices or business owner voices are so valued in the conversation, whether that's a good thing or not? And I think we all agree that it's probably not. Why is that? And what can folks do to, break down that norm or begin to break it down? And, how does that align with what we've been talking about, which is cultivating new business voices, and how does it maybe run contrary to what you've been doing?
Yeah, it's part of the misaligned values of our capitalist system. I remember going to some of these meetings where they were talking about the freight interests and showing up, and the folks that were the biggest advocates for freight in the neighborhood was an event studio, an insurance broker, an office landlord, and a dinner boat operator. And, of them, maybe the dinner boat operator was getting freight. It just seemed like a disingenuous voice to use to be able to then kind of stop any change or reallocation of the public space in that neighborhood. And just using that clout that comes from the business owner voice.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, that voice is being used on kind of many levels in the housing sphere. I think for many businesses and the business associations that I attend, housing is probably the number one issue that's coming up at these meetings, and it's not coming up in a good way. It's speaking about in probably more crass terms, the humanitarian crisis we have on our streets. We have 3 of our locations in Old Town, and I've got neighbors living in tents on my sidewalk or on our sidewalk, and I've got Ronnie and Maria and Shane and Tony, and I know these folks, and it's not fair for them to be living like that. And so these are conversations that are coming up kind of every day, and are probably the most prominent conversations in these meetings. And it's kind of sad, in my opinion, to see that business owners are given such an outsized voice in that conversation. But
Mm-hmm. So maybe part of it is leveraging the relationships that you've built to not just share your perspective, but open it up to other perspectives and what you're observing, and not just what's in your business's interests.
yeah, as Loom was saying, having different levels of the company be involved too. So having the employee voice, having there's a range of perspectives. But then there's also a very important part for the advocacy groups to be showing up at these business meetings as well. We had this organization, Right to Dream 2, that was here in Portland that I thought was doing exceptional work. They were one of our best neighbors in Old Town. And when they were active, they were showing up at the meetings and providing a voice. And that voice is no longer at the table in the, at least in the Old Town conversations. And so, having that range of voices, both within a company, but also within the community, is good, because otherwise you can, the momentum can start snowballing in a really ugly direction.
Mm-hmm. William, any thoughts from you on that?
I don't know how much of this applies outside of Portland. I'm sure it applies to some extent. Portland is not New York. It's not San Francisco. Anytime anything is happening in Portland politically, there's always a question about what about the jobs? What about the revenue base? What's going to happen the next recession? And it gets a lot of play politically, this idea that, we can't have it unless the big employers are on board, because they're kind of the providers. So there's this very patriarchal narrative that is about, the government can't provide, or it can only provide a little bit. And so we're reliant on our big, companies and employers to provide for us. And that's why I think the business voices get so much play, because there's just this implicit assumption that the only way we could possibly provide for people is through these patriarchal organizations. And I think, there's kind of a twofold answer to your question. Like realpolitik, if I have a voice, I'm going to show up and use it, right? I employ people, not as many as Nike. But at the end of the day, I can do good work without necessarily directly challenging that narrative. And I think you got to do that sometimes. At the same time, I do think we need to be challenging the underlying narrative. And I don't know how to do that, to be frank. I think there's an opportunity, though, right now in this moment. If you're a business owner, the number of things that you are being asked to provide for right now to your employees, it's impossible. It's exhausting. It's overwhelming, right? You're not just giving folks a job. In the pandemic, you're giving them a sense of community and belonging and safety. I mean, I remember leading up to the 2020 election, it was just insane what people were bringing to work because they had nowhere else to go with it. And you're not going to say no to your employees when that's where they're at and that's where their needs are. But you can't meet those needs alone. And so I think there's an opportunity to change the conversation and say, no, actually, in order to be a successful business, we need more support, right? We cannot be the only providers. We should not be, abandoning the residents of our city to everyone but their employers, right? And I don't know how to change that narrative, but I think it's really important. And I wonder if right now where we're sitting in this room, if there's an opportunity to change that underlying assumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it makes me think, not to lean on Business for Better Portland too much, although that's been, for the three of us, kind of our conduit, right, to this advocacy work, is recognizing that when you have an organizing structure of some sort, whether it is a convening organization, a coalition, a group of several aligned advocacy groups that are coordinating with each other, you have someone looking out for when it makes sense for different voices to weigh in. And then you have that context and that constellation of perspectives, of which the business voice is one of those. And so you can have folks that might be representing or leading advocacy work, policy work for a business organization, but recognize when it makes sense to bring business voices to the table, when maybe the voices that we have cultivated actually are not representing the community, or representative enough of the community, and when it makes sense to provide some resources and support in the background, with that financial support of the business community, but it, isn't really putting their voice forward. And I think that coordination is just really essential in how that all comes together and what voices are elevated in this conversation. Ryan?
Yeah, and speaking of elevating voices, one element that we haven't mentioned here that I've found particularly useful in sharing different business voices is the press. And I found that some of the nonprofit groups have access and know community members that speak poignantly and can speak authentically to their experience. And having those voices be shared in the press, and when these stories are being crafted and the narratives are being crafted, is really important, because journalists oftentimes have a set list of folks that they're working off of, and to be able to make those introductions is a really crucial role that activists can play. And I just wanted to share that. I've seen just conversations move forward repeatedly by having select quotes by select members and businesses that otherwise might not have been heard by the wider community.
Mm-hmm. So I'd love to open it up to the audience for some questions, and I see that we have one already, or perspectives too. If there's one of the questions that we've addressed that you have an example or have a perspective on, we'd love to hear that as well. Yeah. And if you could stand up and just state your name and kind of where you're from and, what your context is.
Jenny, and I'm from DC, and so I have we have sort of an odd composition of employers, because our biggest employer is not the private sector. But I'm curious a little bit, you're talking mostly about kind of smaller, younger businesses, and I get that they're hard to organize because they have a lot of stuff on their plate and don't have the cash. We have a little bit of the opposite problem, which is that we have some really big companies, a handful of big employers who don't quite see themselves as having a role in local policy advocacy, right? So, they're used to talking to local governments when they need something for themselves, right? I need to get my campus built. I need a zoning area for me. I want a tax break for me, or whatever. But other than that, national corporations, when they do advocacy, they don't do it through the local branches on that local issues, right? Like, they're going through the Chamber of Commerce nationally, or like their industry is lobbying on Capitol Hill. They haven't gotten the idea that, major hospital chains is having problems, like their nurses can't afford a place to live, the hospital chain could actually be talking to local government and advocating for local policy change. Like that's just not on their radar. Right? They do philanthropy, they will cut checks for things, they will lobby nationally. Local policy advocacy is like they've never even heard of this before. Is there a way to engage larger employers? And some of them are also really, really conservative about their corporate image, right? So like, we national hospital chain don't lobby, city council members. Like that's not something we do because we're gonna piss off somebody who's your customer, contributor, vendor or something. How do you get big employers to realize that this is a space that they can activate in? And think about, like they have the resources if they wanted to lean in, they could actually make a big difference, but they're just either it's not on their radar or they're too worried about reputational risk.
That's a great question. I mean, there's two examples I can think of that seem relevant. I don't know if it's the same in DC. One is like larger tech companies. I think there's a similar thing where it's almost like because they work in the cloud, they believe they live in the cloud, and they don't have to engage with the local issues at all, even though it's affecting them and their employees. And then the other example I've seen is a couple of issues where BBPX has weighed in and started with small businesses and created enough of an alternative perspective that we've then been able to get some of those larger employers to weigh in finally, right? But it's a challenge because, like you said, not only are they disengaged, but they're also conservative, right? So I think if it sounds like you're feeling like you sort of have to work with them, right? The small ones are not enough for some of the issues. I would still start with the smaller ones because I think that's how you begin to create. You're sort of de-risking it for the bigger ones, right? And also making it so it's a little bit more turnkey. Just add your name to this thing. There's already 500 companies, and we just need a couple of big voices, right? Then they're not alone if they're conservative and they're thinking, whoa, what if we're the ones who get in trouble? They're not alone in that. And then the other thing that I think, again, can work right now is like appealing to employees, right? Because if they're conservative, they're probably worried about attrition, depending on what kind of employer they are. And the more at risk they are with respect to their workforce, the harder you should hit them there, right? Because that's what's going to get them to move. So if there are smaller competitor companies, even if they're not direct competitors, if they're competing for mind share and sort of goodwill in the community, work with those folks first and say, hey, you're going to be alone here. You're really going to look like the big bad wolf if you're not on board with this. That's what's worked here. That's what's worked in the context I mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that peer pressure is really important, really helpful. But it's momentum too, and you got to figure out which lever you're pulling a little bit harder. And it depends on the dynamics of the particular situation.
Totally.
But either way, it requires that organizing force a little bit to show that it's not, a small advocacy group or something asking a large employer, but it's, other businesses or peers of theirs that are coming together, that are recognizing this is a major issue, making the business and economic case to them for why they should get involved. Because especially when they're representing, when you're the owner or have some decision-making power in a small business, you can say, well, we just care about this thing. We just see it as important for the future and the success of our community, and that's tied to the success of our business. More, a little amorphous kind of connection works, and you can kind of sell it within your organization because you've probably created that culture and those values. But with a large organization, they need to see, okay, how does this impacting the bottom line a little bit more directly? So whether it's transportation or housing or public health, I think making that economic case for them from peers is really helpful in helping push them forward.
Yeah, on that note, I'll just say, if your challenge is working with an organization, a company, where they're saying oh, what's the ROI, right? It's just really, really difficult to say, yeah, an investment in a long-term issue like affordable housing is going to, deliver an ROI. And if you give us let's just say you're asking for money, give us 20K, you're going to see an ROI on that, right? They can't take that to the board and be like, oh yeah, here's how it pencils out. I think the most direct ROI, the one that makes it a no-brainer for them, is the employees, right? If they can say, oh yeah, our employees work with this organization, it's important, this is a difficult economy, blah, 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 right? They have a whole budget around just keeping their employees happy. They could be spending that on waffles, or they could be spending that on community engagement, right? And so your goal is to make the case that employees care more about supporting their community than they do about the free waffles.
Yeah. And to your point before too, I think cultivating from the ground up. So engaging at other levels of the organization as opposed to, you're also going straight to the top. It's probably a both and strategy. But figuring out who in that organization does have the local connection and does care about these things and might be an advocate from within as well. Other thought, before we move on to other questions, other thoughts on that question that folks might want to share? All right, other questions. Yeah, in the back here.
Hey, I'm Jessica from the Action and Los Angeles. I feel like you said that there are companies who would, have this proposed, would say no, and they're in the room and super guests in the room. And I don't know. From my perspective, I don't understand why any housing would be detrimental to a business. Like, it just is at more customers, more housing stock. That, as an urban planner, I'm not seeing that connection. But I know that business owners are also human, and they might be afraid of change or afraid of the unknown renter. Do you have any insight into reasons why a company might oppose a housing project?
Revenue. That's usually, if we're talking about affordable housing, it's how are we going to pay for it?
So they're concerned about the city's budget.
Yeah, or speaking to the local issue, this was a regional housing measure, right? And so concerns about adding anything to the, tax load is basically just a perennial, anytime you're talking about raising taxes, you're guaranteed that some business owners are going to be pissed off. So.
But not a specific housing project to be built by someone else's.
Yeah, this is a really good point. There's a lot of situations where it's not zero sum, right? Where it's not any skin off the business owner's back, to have a project that has more units or has less parking or whatever, right? They don't really care probably because again, you can't make the case with data that one code change or that one project getting done is going to directly impact their ROI. So they're just tunnel vision, running my business, I don't care, right? But if you can figure out how to get them out of that tunnel vision, it's a great opportunity. So to give you an example, one of the things that we worked on for Business Server Better Portland was there was a bunch of data to suggest that eliminating parking minimums would make a lot of projects pencil out that wouldn't otherwise pencil out. There was also a lot of great advocacy work happening to try to add affordable housing requirements to new developments of a certain size. So default business owner perspective is, don't want to do that. My project doesn't pencil out if you're saying that I have to provide more affordable housing. But we were able to connect those two voices and say, hey, what if we link those two together? If you build these units, you don't have to build the parking, right? It's like a YIMBY town dream. And actually, it was so successful that not only did we get some developers to support that, when the code change went into effect, some of the developers voluntarily went and took their projects back through permitting so that they could build the units instead of the parking, right? And all it took was connecting those voices and getting that person and those developers out of their tunnel vision perspective.
Yeah, the other space that I see it, it is in our neighborhood, Old Town. The business association is adamantly opposed to any affordable housing, any shelters, or even the new safe rest villages. So in the neighborhood that's traditionally been Skid Row for the last 100 years or so, it's the neighborhood that is refusing to have any more social services provided. And so that's an example where the business owners have came in and kind of externalized their costs, having cheaper rent, cheaper mortgages, whatever, and then want to gentrify the neighborhood and are now opposing anything to help our neighbors on the streets.
Yeah, and in terms of organizing strategy, I think one thing to think about too is just where you're spending that precious organizing time, and really thinking about shifting that energy from maybe persuading businesses that might oppose to cultivating support, and thinking about the power of unexpected messengers. And when you have, a litany of businesses that you would expect to oppose something come in and say, well, I oppose that. And then you have one or two voices come in and say, oh, actually, I'm really supportive. And it's for these 5 really clear reasons that both connect to the health and safety and economic future of our community, but also my employees and my business. All of a sudden, the ears of those elected officials often perk up, and that can cut through. And sometimes you have, especially in communities like LA, Portland as well, elected officials who are feeling a lot of pressure from old guard business voices to do a certain thing, but it's not what they want to do because they're more aligned with a progressive activist community, but they need some cover. And so finding the 2 or 3 business voices that can give them that cover so they can say, well, it's not all businesses. I've got businesses over here saying they oppose, businesses over here saying they support it, so I guess we should support it, is really helpful in those circumstances. I know that might not be your exact situation. But. Other thoughts on that question before we keep going? All right. Right here, Laura?
Hi. So we live currently in a very hyper-partisan, ideological purity society right now. Everything's polarizing. So in a business,
So they can hear you on the stream.
oh, okay.
Not sure the audio on that microphone
Yeah,
is working.
it is.
Sorry about that. Hardly 2 places at once.
Is it working now?
How's that?
It's not spitting at me.
That
Not
great.
spitting at me.
Thanks, Laura.
All right, so we live in this polarizing environment right now, and a business owner, they're very skittish. They don't want to really stand up and put their business name on the line. So how have you, from your own customers, have you had any pushback when you take a stand on these issues? And how did you handle that with your customers?
Yeah, I've got customers all over the country. They really range in political beliefs. More just reputationally, Portland. I was getting questions over the last year and a half from, folks from Cedar Rapids or from Florida or wherever they were about, how's the anarchist jurisdiction of Portland going? And I would try to calmly explain that our shop is, 6 blocks from the Justice Center, and that there's very important racial justice protests occurring right now, and that sometimes those messages are sidelined, and would try to share some anecdotal experience. And just try to navigate that. As far as the pushback goes, they wanted, if they need to get an ice cream truck for someone else, maybe they need it too. So,
Right. I know, William, before you said something before that I think is really helpful in this context too, which is helping businesses see that they're not alone, so that they're not that sole voice. And I think a sign-on letter is a great strategy for that. And thinking about the order of who you go to first to sign on to that, so that there's a critical mass of folks. So at no point can they be singled out and pointed out to say, oh, it was just you that supported this, and that doesn't align with all of the values of all of the customers that you have, but it's actually quite a few respected, trusted voices in the community.
Yeah, we haven't really experienced this because we sell to local city governments. So, they're already kind of aligned with what we're advocating for. And also most of our customers are not local, so they're not super aware of what we might have signed on to at a local level. So I guess the way I would just spin this is that, there are a lot of younger, again, smaller businesses that chose to be in a market that's values aligned. right? And so for them, it's the inverse, right? If they don't show up, it's a risk. And a lot of them don't. Like, it's shocking, but like a lot of folks that start values and mission-aligned businesses don't actually show up, especially locally. But a lot of times they're just not political at all, right? They're like, oh, that's why I started a business, because I don't believe in that, right? I don't know how to do that, so I'm starting a business. I'm going to just do my thing. I'm going to be a part of the solution, but I don't really know or care about the other folks that are coming at it a different way. So if you're able to flip that where, they see it as a risk to not show up, that's great, right? Obviously, that's an easy win.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Let's go right here, and then we'll go to the corner.
I work for, my name is Sarah Ray, and I work for an environmental nonprofit advocacy organization in Oregon. And one of the things I'd like to hear a little bit more about is actually separating out political values from the common sense outcomes that we want to see. There's real tension perceived between urban and rural or suburban interests. And I think the anarchist jurisdiction of Portland can often be dismissed in a decision-making capacity, particularly from small businesses who identify as progressive, and that is dismissed at the state level.
Mm-hmm.
So what I'm curious about is expanding the business argument beyond progressive business owners to say it's in all of our interests. There's a business case for higher density, more walkable, accessible communities, and to create that narrative. So I'd love to hear sort of your thoughts on that.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it just once again calls for that wider range of business voices, and especially throughout the state as well. Portland, we have our own internal politics, and those can be dismissed on the state level. Where are the voices in Falls and Medford and elsewhere that there's obviously businesses there that are well invested in their community, that know they need housing for their employees, and also are seeing that we have a current crisis on the streets as well. So it seems, not an answer, but we need more statewide voices.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a coincidence that Business for Better Portland started as a locally focused Chamber of Commerce and is now doing a lot of work at the state level. Some of that's because, like the law that you need or the funding that you need is only available at the state level. But particularly when it comes to housing, I think a lot of times there's this somewhat maybe paradoxical thing that happens where the more local your representation is, the harder it is to get anything done, right? Like, I think if you went out and you talked to average Portlander and said, hey, I want to build a 6-story building right next to you, they might not be stoked. They might not fight it, but they might not be stoked. But if you ask that same person, should we have more of these types of dense housing all over the state? They'd be like, oh yeah, 100%, right? So a lot of times, and you saw this with middle housing in Oregon, the city struggled for, I don't even know how many years, to try to get zoning reform passed. And it just couldn't happen because the individual neighborhoods that were affected by that were really effective at getting, organized and opposing it. But when you took it finally to the state level, the state was able to pass some of the most progressive zoning reform in the country relatively quickly, and then, basically force Portland to get its act together. So, I mean, it doesn't entirely answer your question. I think, it's an issue by issue thing. Sometimes, with housing, a lot of times you can neatly bifurcate because people in Klamath Falls don't really care what happens to zoning reform in Portland. But that issue needed to advance at the state level. And then in other cases, maybe it's more, you're just not going to find those business voices aligned unless you're working at the local level. So I don't know. I mean, the real answer is you need organizations that do both. And I don't think you can have defined swim lanes. You can't have this org only works at the state level, this only works at the local level, because it's very tactical when and where you should go for an individual issue. And you might have to switch because with zoning reform, you find it's just not happening in one area.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in Oregon, that's kind of the next phase, right? Is identifying enough the resources for organizations to expand or create allied organizations at the state level on some of these issues, and with enough resource to really identify and clearly participate in creating and supporting the political strategy, and really letting the political strategy lead at that level, especially when you get into the state issues of what voices need to be heard by whom at what time, and it becomes really tactical. And where can those business voices either hurt or help in that conversation? And I think to date, at least, the ecosystem that's been built in the Portland region, partly, that was derailed by COVID a bit, the momentum that had been built among Business for Better Portland members to go and advocate for anything that's not just straight up COVID assistance and keeping their doors open. But I think the need is still there to continue to build that bench of businesses that are available, but also funding the political strategy so that they can coordinate and collaborate. And then weigh in when it's appropriate and valuable, and step back and support the larger agenda when it's not. Noah?
Hi, I'm Noah Siegel. I'm from Portland, and I have the pleasure of being a City of Portland government employee working with all three of these folks from Business for Better Portland. And William, you gave I can attest to how nice it is to have a business alternative that isn't just about, lower our taxes and do this for us, but having a partnership with business around making a better place. But William, you gave an example of sort of when you were facing the developer community or the business community and showing them how things could align. And I was wondering just a little bit about your thoughts on, when government has its head up its ass. And although we're all friends and trying to do the same stuff, so-and-so's job is to widen sidewalks, and so-and-so's job is to do development, and those things are in conflict and they can't resolve it. And do you have any thoughts about being a good ally to people in government when it's not working?
And I'm going to restate Noah's question a little bit. I've been tasked with, because we're recording, restating. So Noah's from Portland, has worked in the public sector before and the advocacy realm, and is asking, when government isn't working and they're a roadblock, I'm going to paraphrase here for our online audience. How do you get through to them? How can you work with them when things aren't working?
It's a really good one. I wish I had an example, because I certainly feel that frustration all the time. My default tendency is to question my frustration and say, am I frustrated because this isn't happening as fast as I would want it to, or because I have unrealistic expectations, or I'm just not seeing the whole picture. But sometimes it really is like, no, I've done the work and I've talked to people and it seems like this is just not working the way it should. And, I think at that point, you have to make a difficult decision as an advocate about whether you're going to sort of support your allies in the public sector or whether you're going to hold their feet to the fire a little bit. And I think what I've seen in advocacy is that when an organization's default, is to sort of assume good intent and to be an ally, those times where you're holding the feet to the fire, right, they are more likely to stop and take note, right? And hopefully that makes a difference. But I definitely have seen that tension where, because Business for a Better Portland is the go-to voice for supporting any kind of progressive policy change, it almost feels a little bit like a rubber stamp sometimes. And if there are deep problems with how the implementation is going or just with what's being proposed, it's really hard to be like, as a busy business owner or as a, board member at this business group, I have the authority and the expertise to say, no, this isn't good. This isn't good enough. And hopefully you're hearing that from your colleagues in advocacy, right? Hopefully you're hearing from other advocates who are sharing the frustration. And if it's just a business owner, being frustrated, I think it's I can't think of an example where I've felt like, enough confidence to oppose a public initiative on those grounds, unfortunately, even though I think it's probably warranted sometimes.
Ryan?
Yeah, just to chime in, I'd also say don't be afraid to coordinate and have those kind of sidebar conversations to get additional context or share additional context. Sometimes advocates, business owners, government officials can all be kind of in the dark over who's approaching the issue from which sides, and so just a little sidebar email or a sidebar text message can be really helpful in figuring out how to like most effectively deploy. I know many advocates would want to know how to be the most effective, just as
Yeah, if there's an issue and you can like buttonhole a staff member off the record, a lot of times they'll be like, yeah, I know it's completely messed up, and I don't know what to do, or I don't have the right support, right? And so that is something that obviously makes it way easier, right? If the city official is basically begging you to hold their feet to the fire because either their colleagues or something in the process or whatever is just standing in their way, I mean, we all do a lot of like self-limiting in terms of what options we think are available and are viable. And I think city officials, like just by virtue of their job, they have to do that. So anyway, that's +1 to the sidebars.
Yeah, if we could pool our funds and pay for free tattoos for public agency officials that said don't be afraid to coordinate, might be really helpful. And a lot of that confidence building of, we are there to support you, to help you. We understand how hard this is. So being a bit of a therapist to our friends on the public sector side, and recognizing the challenges that they have, it can be really helpful, so that trust is built. And Noah, I think you've had a lot of experience with this. Having folks who have the advocacy experience on the public sector side is really helpful too. And we don't always get to choose who the partners are, but building that experience and having that kind of cross training is so valuable. Yep.
Speaking of not choosing who your partners are, do Businesses for Better Portland, do you guys endorse candidates or fund candidates in elections? If hypothetically there are candidates running for, say, county executive who look like they would be better on housing than others, do you get involved with that?
Sort of. So C6 organization, which is the Chamber of Commerce, can't take, or it's very limited when you can take, money from your members and use it for direct advocacy on an issue or a candidate. So what a lot of chambers of commerce and Business for Better Portland end up doing this is they form like a sister organization or separate filing for a C4 or sometimes a PAC, so that they can do that kind of work. We've certainly taken an issue on several bond measures. You can also just do that as long as you're clear with your accounting that you're not spending that membership money on those issues, right? If you have other money. I don't think we've taken, we don't tend to endorse candidates because we were like, well, we got to work with whoever gets elected, right? So thus far, I think we have.
Yeah, I think that's been a decision to date, at least, has been to not endorse candidates, partly because of the local political dynamics of who the organization might support versus who might be most likely to get elected and post-election dynamics.
Yeah.
But also just because I think there's been an intentional decision to weigh in on policy issues, and that's also taken up the majority of resources and time and attention for organization, has also built the broadest base of support for the work. So not to say that that wouldn't happen at some date in the future. It's certainly been discussed, but not to date. I think we have time for one more question before we wrap up in the middle. I know we've been waiting.
Tim, I'm a stay-at-home dad, also William's neighbor. I'm just kind of curious about the internal dynamics you have in your business themselves and your relationship with employees. So on the hiring process, are you transparent about your progressive advocacy? When there's issues that are up, do you powwow with your employees? Do you have veto? Just kind of want to know how that all works out.
That's a good question. I mean, I think it's kind of like, again, it's like trying not to build like a patriarchal organization where you say, hey, I'm in charge, so I'm going to, choose the default sort of position for the company on every issue. At the same time, like, I think you have to be outspoken about what you believe, right? I don't think it's inappropriate for a business owner to say, this is the candidate I'm supporting and here's why. I know that's controversial, but I think that that's appropriate if you're a progressive business owner and you're doing that and you're reasoned about your approach, as long as you're also doing everything you can to create space and a forum for disagreement around anything, and I think that's where I see the real, what you're saying is, I'm a progressive business owner and I have these beliefs, so you should join this company or stay at this company because it aligns with your values. But also, I'm making space, right? Providing resources in the form of like, hey, if you're an employee at this business, you get the resources at Business for a Better Portland. You're not just getting my perspective, right? You're getting access to education and that civic on-ramp so that you can deepen your own advocacy and, feel like, yes, my employer might not agree with me on every issue, but they support me being a truer version of myself, living up to my values, even when they disagree. I think if you're able to do both, that's what feels like the right balance to me.
Ryan?
Yeah, sharing our values seems to be one of the ways that we're attracting talent as well. Right now, we've had one of the easiest hiring periods we've ever had in the last 4 to 5 months. People seem to be wanting to work places they want to work. My biggest challenge in that context has been onboarding folks and sharing kind of the cultural values, and especially when it comes to the folks that are living on our doorstep, and how can I set good expectations both for our neighbors but with our employees? How do I keep everyone safe? How do we create boundaries but open lines of communication? And that's really been the biggest challenge that we've had recently.
Yeah, I know we had one more question in the back corner here. Yep.
Yeah, hey, Phil from Portland, Keegan pronouns. Just wanted to ask, what impact do you see B Corps having on the future of business?
So the question and the impact of B Corps. William, you had a reaction.
We're not a B Corp, so I don't feel qualified to answer the question really.
Yeah, likewise, we have not pursued B Corp status. We've looked into it a bit, but
What is B Corp?
B Corp, as a kind of an organization affiliation, I think there is specific certification for companies that meet certain standards of sustainability, social equity, and other community impacts. One thing, I know there is a line of communication open to the local B Corp organization between Business for Better Portland and that organization. So I think that's one place, and I think there's a lot of overlap between those communities as well. My understanding is that the B Corp community is more business to business best practices. How can we operate within our kind of business entity to those values and standards? And Business for Better Portland much more being kind of outside our business entity. How do we live up to those values and standards? So that's kind of, I don't think that's been maybe clearly articulated between those organizations, but I think that's the kind of rough breakdown that we have locally anyway. So we're at noon. I know folks have plenty to do over the afternoon, the next couple of days. So thank you so much for joining us for this conversation.